Welcome back to another episode of Grace, Grit, and Grounds. I'm so happy you're able to take some time out of your busy day to have a conversation. You know, there's something holy about the quiet before the day starts shouting. This morning opened with me standing out in the backyard. Coffee's tougher cousin was in my hand, an energy drink doing its best impersonation of motivation, and the sun just beginning to stretch itself over the trees. The grass was still carrying that early morning hush, the kind that makes the whole world feel like it hasn't made any bad decisions yet. I stood there looking over the yard, thinking about the list waiting on me. You know, there's always a list, isn't there? Things to fix, calls to return, responsibilities stacked like firewood, necessary and heavy. Ministry, work, family, projects, people. Life has a way of filling every empty corner if you let it. But for a little while, before the noise started, before the emails and the obligations and the 1,000 tiny demands of being an adult showed up with a clipboard, I had a pocket of time, and I couldn't think of a better place to spend it than the woodshop. There's a strange kind of peace in walking into a woodshop before the world is fully awake. The smell hits me first. Wood dust, oil, old projects, unfinished ideas. You know, every shop has its own language, and if you spend enough time in one, it starts to feel almost like a sanctuary. Some people have mountain cabins, some people have fishing boats. I have a lathe and a questionable amount of sawdust, and honestly, I think that counts. This morning, sitting on the lathe was a small square blank of curly maple. Nothing flashy from the outside, just a block of wood waiting to become something else. I've been a little obsessed with this curly maple lately. I had a larger slab of it, and I cut it down into several blanks. And I've managed to pull maybe 5 or 6 bowls out of it already. Every one of them is a little bit different, and every one of them has reminded me why I love doing this. Curly maple is one of those woods that make you stop and look twice. It doesn't have the grain so much as it has movement. See, light will dance across it, and the figuring almost looks like ripples in water or fabric folded over on itself. And when the finish hits it just right, it looks like the wood is alive. That's where the name comes from, by the way. It's called curly maple because of the figure in the grain. Those shimmering wave-like patterns that seem to curl across the surface. It's not a different species of maple. It's just a growth pattern, a natural anomaly in the grain itself. Nobody can point to one exact reason why it happens. Some people say it's stress in the tree. I personally think it's soil conditions and mineral content, maybe even a little bit of climate and wind exposure thrown in for good measure. Possibly the seasons even. I'm not really sure. Maybe it could be a little of all of that. Honestly, that sounds a little like people too, if you think about it. Sometimes the most beautiful parts of us are formed by pressure, not comfort. Sometimes the figure, the character, the thing that makes us distinct comes from seasons we wouldn't have chosen. Curly maple grows in different places. But here in Kentucky, near Indiana, you'll often find some very beautiful examples of it. Different regions produce different woods, different personalities in the grain, if you will. You see, trees, like people, are shaped where they stand. And that piece this morning, sitting there in the lathe, well, it felt exactly like what I needed. Because if I'm honest, I needed a win. I'd had a few projects lately that didn't go the way I planned. Some pieces failed because I made mistakes. It happens. Some were flawed before I ever touched them. Cracks hiding in the wood where I couldn't see them. Weak spots that only showed up once the turning really began. That little fact right there will preach all by itself. Some failures are ours. Some failures are handed to us. But either way, they still hurt. There's a particular frustration in putting time and effort into something only to watch it come apart in your hands. If you work with wood long enough, you learn humility whether you want to or not. The wood will teach you, usually right after it embarrasses you. And failure can be as good a teacher as anything else. For me, it forces patience. It exposes the shortcuts that I try to take. It reminds me that skill is often just stubbornness that survived long enough to become competence. But if all you ever experience is failure, it starts to become something else. It becomes a voice, a whisper that says, maybe you're not good enough. Maybe you're behind. Maybe you missed your chance. Maybe this is as far as you'll ever go. And if you listen to that voice long enough, failure stops being an event and starts becoming an identity. That's when it gets dangerous. Because God may use failure as a lesson, but the enemy loves to use failure as a label. And I think a lot of men live there. They don't say it out loud, but they carry it. A failed marriage, a failed dream, maybe a business that didn't go right, faith that doesn't seem as full as it used to. Maybe they failed as a father. Maybe failed as discipline. Or my favorite, failed other people's expectations. 1,000 quiet funerals nobody else attended. That's what they feel like. And somewhere along the way, they stop trying to build because they're afraid of breaking one more thing. That's why this little bowl mattered this morning. I mean, honestly, it wasn't about the bowl. It was about reminding myself that failure doesn't get the final word. Sometimes you need to start your day with something simple and good, something honest and finished. Sometimes you need to put your hands on something and remember that you're still capable of creating something beautiful. So I mounted that blank on the lathe and it just worked. No drama, no hidden cracks, no weird catches or tear outs, no surprise explosions that make you question your entire bloodline. Just good wood doing what good wood does. I rounded it out. I found the shape that I wanted, and I let the curve start to reveal itself. There's always that moment in turning where the block stops looking like a block and starts looking like what it's meant to be. I enjoy that moment a lot. Eventually, I flipped it around and used Forstner bits to start clearing out the center. The first excavation really matters because before refinement, there has to be some removal. I think there's another sermon hiding there as well. God often starts with subtraction before he moves to addition. We pray for purpose, and instead he hands us pruning. We ask for a calling, but first he starts cutting away distractions. We often want clarity, but he'll start with surrender. Nobody likes that part, but hollowing creates capacity. You cannot fill what refuses to be emptied. The shaping of the outside came easy, and the inside flowed smooth. The tool rest was steady, and my hands were calm. I had music playing softly in my ears. I think worship music hits a little differently in the shop. Maybe it's because there's something deeply human about creating while listening to songs about the Creator. Maybe it's because rhythm helps prayer when words sometimes feel clumsy. Maybe it's just because some mornings God speaks louder through song and the spinning of a piece of wood than he does through 1,000 complicated thoughts. One of my favorite passages in Scripture is Psalm 46:10. Part of that verse simply says, "Be still and know that I am God." Most of us read it like a Hallmark card. It's soft, quiet, maybe a little breathy and gentle. But the language itself carries weight. It means to stop striving, to release your grip, to let go. It's less sit peacefully by the lake and more of like, put the sword down and let God do the work. Be still. Stop trying to save yourself. Stop trying to outrun your fear. Stop trying to prove your worth. Know that I am God. That verse has a lathe-like rhythm to it because wood turning will humble you if you try to force it. You can't bully the grain. You can't overpower bad angles with confidence and masculine optimism. I've tried. It mostly produces firewood. You have to pay attention. You have to listen. You have to let the material tell you what it needs. Sometimes faith looks a lot like that. Not louder effort, better listening. Not so much the frantic motion that we all find ourselves falling into, rather more of a faithful presence. Not seeking to dominate, but instead surrender. And in that quiet shop, with the morning still soft around the edges, I felt that. Not some dramatic spiritual lightning bolt. There were no choirs of angels descending over my bandsaw. It was just peace. Simple, steady peace. And maybe that's what some of us are missing. Because we keep waiting for God to be spectacular when most of the time, He's just beautifully consistent. He meets us in ordinary faithfulness, in prayer before sunrise, in showing up again and again, in doing the next right thing, in sanding what still feels rough, in trying again and again after failure, in choosing hope when disappointment would be a lot easier. That's where He often lives. Not just in the miracle moments, but in the maintenance. The final sanding always reminds me of sanctification. Nobody likes the sanding process. If somebody tells you sanding is their favorite part, they're either lying or they need an altar experience. But sanding is where refinement happens. You can't skip it and expect beauty. You move through the grit slowly like I did, patiently. And what looked smooth at first eventually reveals more flaws the closer you get. That's life with Christ too. You think pride is an issue until God gets closer and shows you the fear that is underneath it. You think maybe anger is the issue until He reveals the underlying grief that fuels it. You think exhaustion might be a clue until He shows you that you have misplaced worship. Refinement is rarely glamorous, but it matters. Eventually, we get to the best part, the finish. Oil on curly maple is one of those deeply satisfying moments that make you feel like maybe civilization was worth inventing. The grain wakes up, the figure in the wood starts to shimmer. Everything hidden becomes visible. And every time I watch it happen, I think the same thing. There is glory in what God reveals after the shaping and the sanding. Some of you are in a sanding season right now, and you think that means nothing beautiful is happening. But I have to say it's just the opposite. It might mean that you are closer than you think. Because God's not trying to destroy you. He's trying to reveal what He placed in you. That bowl this morning, it wasn't my best work, I'll be honest. It wasn't a large piece, and it won't change civilization as a whole. Nobody's going to be naming a national holiday after this bowl. But it was good. And sometimes good is holy enough. Sometimes the victory is not in the giant breakthroughs. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let discouragement have the last word. Sometimes it's waking up early, walking into the shop, turning on good music, and making something with your hands. Remembering who you are. Remembering whose you are. So if you're carrying failure today, hear me clearly. Failure is a teacher, not a prophet. It gets to instruct us, but it doesn't get to define us. God is not finished because you had a hard season. You are not disqualified because something broke. You are not behind because the path took longer than expected. Some of the finest grain only shows up after pressure. Some of the most beautiful figuring comes out from the strain. Some of the strongest faith is born in the quiet mornings when nobody sees you choose to keep going. That little curly maple bowl reminded me of that. Maybe that's why I needed it. Not because I needed proof that I could make something, but because I needed the reminder that grace still meets us in ordinary places, that peace still lives in the process. And that sometimes is the best way to start the day, not with productivity, but with presence. Grace builds what grit sustains. And sometimes grit looks like walking back into the shop one more time. If something I've said resonates with you today, like and subscribe this channel. It matters more than you know. It gets this message in front of others that need to hear it. Thanks so much for taking time with me this morning. Until we meet again, please keep the coffee warm, keep the conversation flowing. Until next time.